Hi, everyone. Phil Travis here. History 458, Civil War and Reconstruction here at EOU. So I'm going to break Reconstruction up into two parts. I'm going to give you kind of a general overview to the reading that you are doing in the Phoner book for the next 2 weeks. The Civil War and the Reconstruction period really was a fundamental change in the history of the United States. In one respect, the Civil War and the Reconstruction period, it changes how we define citizenship in the country. Citizenship in the United States was no longer based on race. And this was a huge change for the United States. At the outset of the U.S. constitutional period, 1790, the United States had passed the naturalization law, which effectively stated that that citizens of the country were whites of European descent. Thomas Jefferson had, written about this in some length. Thomas Jefferson believed that the United States had to be ethnically similar in order to be a cohesive nation. And so the country for, almost 100 years to this point had really been fundamentally defined by race or ethnicity. Americans and people who were considered citizens in the country, up until this period, whiteness was a key component to whether or not you were actually considered an American and had citizenship and had the rights of citizens. Of course, despite Reconstruction, because Reconstruction is a failure, the South becomes embodied by a mass disenfranchisement of the African American population and segregation. And so you really don't see this truly take effect until relatively recently in the country's history. And you could argue that even today, many Americans still define citizenship as somehow based on ethnicity or race. But of course, this is challenged by the war. The war challenges this idea, and technically by law, of course, fundamentally citizenship was no longer based on race. And the United States it never exclusively based citizenship on race. We had a citizenship that was also kind of a civic nationalism based on shared ideas about rights of liberty, about government, and these types of things. But it was also embodied in ethnic nationalism. And the beginning of kind of chipping away at this, we should say, because in many cases in the future after this, whether it's the Chinese Exclusion Act or the immigration laws in the early 1920s, America very much still, many Americans in the government often define citizenship through the lens of race. But nonetheless, this was the beginning of a chipping away at that and creating a notion in which being American and citizenship in the country was not somehow linked to a perceived whiteness. Huge demographic changes. The makeup of cities and in population demographics in the South fundamentally changes. And of course, African American populations moved around inside the South. Plantation land was broken up. Towns that were once majority white and excluded African Americans were, in some cases, their demographic changed fundamentally. Urban areas city areas where African Americans came to find work, which they were incredibly disappointed to find that there was really no good work for them. People would not hire them. They were really reserved to the lowest paying menial work. But in many cases, the African American community built like shanty towns around the outskirts of the town, on the wrong side of the tracks, if you will. And so you have a fundamental demographic shift. And that demographic shift, of course, remains significant. This is like, in a lot of ways, the beginning of de facto segregation in some respects, as cities become increasingly divided ethnically, and the areas of the city where there are the most African Americans, densely populated African American areas, are oftentimes the poorest because of lack of opportunity with education and with work. And so there's a fundamental demographic shift that's going on here. It also represents an expansion of federal power over states' rights. And of course, in some respects, I mean, of course, states' rights was at the core of the Civil War in general. The argument over, does a state have a right to secede? Does the federal government have authority over the interests of the states or the laws of the states? And it had been consistently asserted in the lead up to the Civil War that the federal government did have authority over the states. But through the Reconstruction period, you see this formally changed in a more fundamental sense with the 14th and 15th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, which is passed during the Reconstruction period in the 1860s against the opposition of Andrew Johnson. The 14th Amendment, the president at the time, the 14th Amendment basically guarantees that no state can violate the constitutional rights of its citizens. So a state can never pass a law that violates the constitutional rights of citizens of its state. This is one of the most significant amendments to the Constitution, and it's the 14th Amendment that really gives the teeth to civil rights campaigns in the future, as states were consistently violating the constitutional rights of their inhabitants. And of course, the position, as I understand it, of the Supreme Court on the issue of same-sex marriage today is also a 14th Amendment thing, because the case is that states who are refusing to allow same-sex couples from marrying are withholding one particular group on the basis of their sexuality the full rights to citizenship, if you will, in their states, by withholding, because of their sexuality, excluding them the right to marry. So it's an incredibly significant amendment, the 14th Amendment is. And the 14th Amendment was passed there was great animosity from the Southern apologist Andrew Johnson, and from members of the South, and from Democrats in the North. But the Republican-led Congress in the North is able to create the necessary votes in the states of the North that are in the Union at the time and in the Congress to amend the Constitution. The 15th Amendment as well in 1870 provided for full manhood suffrage, and was very significant for bringing federal manhood suffrage to African Americans as well as to whites. Of course, over time, Reconstruction will fail, and the South will revert into what's called the Jim Crow era, in which African American populaces were widely disenfranchised, and most disenfranchised in the Deep South, where by the 1950s, only 5% of the African American populace in the Deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, and so forth, could vote. So a fundamental change in the United States, change in citizenship, change in the federal power, change in the Constitution, huge demographic shifts, so very significant. It's very difficult to know what Abraham Lincoln would have done had he not been assassinated in April of 1865. Lincoln, as had been suggested in the peace negotiation, or the attempt at a peace negotiation that happened at the beginning of 1865, certainly if we look at that and we look at Lincoln's plan for reunifying the country, it seems that Lincoln would have been relatively easy on the South when it came to reunification. Lincoln's plan was that 10% of the pre-Civil War population would need to renounce secession and swear allegiance to the United States. When this 10% of the population did this, the state would be readmitted as part of the Union. So both Lincoln and Johnson's Lincoln's vice president, wanted a quick and painless reunification of the Union. And so it's difficult to say the course that Lincoln would have taken, because there's going to be a very distinct battle between Congress and the executive over who controls Reconstruction. But it's difficult how Lincoln would have handled it. But I think one thing is certain, and that is that he would have handled it far better than his vice president, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was really probably the worst person to have in the executive office at the time of Reconstruction. He was on Lincoln's ticket in 1864 primarily to get votes because, of course, as you guys remember reading, Lincoln had a significant opposition from Democrats in the North and the Copperheads. Lincoln put Johnson on his ticket because Johnson was from Tennessee. He was the only Southern politician to not secede with his state. And so Johnson had the ability to curry the favor of some of the people that were opposing Lincoln as he represented the middle states, if you will. And I mean, the southern states would be really kind of irrelevant, but he represented people that might be sympathizing with the plight of the South. And so he's appointed for that reason, but he was really never thought that he would be the president. That was never really considered. And his becoming the president was really quite disastrous for Reconstruction. Unlike Lincoln, Lincoln's a very savvy politician. Lincoln, going back to Fort Sumter, Lincoln was very, very keen, and he knew how to build compromises, and he knew how to create support within his government. Undoubtedly, Lincoln would have handled the situation of Reconstruction far better than Johnson. Johnson was arguably the most racist U.S. president. He had very little education. He was a tailor, actually, and some people called him Andy Taylor and things like this, or Andy the Tailor, or the Taylor president. They also called him Andy Veto because he was very stubborn. And as a result of being so stubborn, Johnson completely refused to compromise with Congress on Reconstruction, and as a result, he set records for his attempts to veto congressional legislation. And I'm pretty sure he has the record for the amount of times he was overturned by a congressional vote of 2/3 to overturn a veto. Andrew Johnson really was someone who was going. It was going to be a very difficult run for Johnson and Congress over Reconstruction. But ultimately, Johnson will become the ultimate lame duck president, despite the fact that many in the South would have supported him. Those people would not have really had an ability to have much political say in the matter. And of course, there were Democrats in the North who supported him, but ultimately he becomes a true lame duck president. And Johnson is impeached, ultimately. Johnson escapes removal by impeachment by one vote. So Johnson's Reconstruction Plan, which was, he would insist, a carryover of Lincoln's plan, but in a lot of ways was made very much his own. Especially Lincoln had certainly suggested that blacks could have some kind of political activity and some kind of political voice in the new governments, and this is something Johnson fundamentally didn't agree with. Johnson did not believe that non-whites could be citizens, and he was intent on securing white control in the South. Johnson pardoned all Confederates. The higher-up officers, of course, needed to apply for a presidential pardon, but by and large, all Confederates were pardoned. Johnson allowed the Southern states to vote and form their representatives to go to Washington. And by the end of 1865, Johnson declared that Reconstruction was complete, and the Union was that the process was over, and that we could kind of get back to doing what we needed to do as a nation. Of course, this is when Johnson really runs up against opposition from Republicans in Congress who, one, are angry because he had vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau, but also Republicans in Congress who are particularly angry over the fact that this reunification, this Reconstruction, has come at a complete ignoring of the situation for the freedmen, for the blacks in the South. Republicans in Congress wanted to encourage true democracy in the South, in which blacks would have a political voice. Johnson tried to resist this, and Johnson certainly hoped to overturn the slave aristocracy of the pre-war period, but he hoped to establish white rule in the South, kind of white yeoman rule in the South, and he went to great lengths to encourage Southern states to enact the things like the black codes to control their African-American populace and encourage Southern states to resist incorporating African-Americans into the new political apparatus. And so Johnson pushes forth his own version of Reconstruction and does so really with completely ignoring taking any measures on the political representation for freedmen in the South. And it's at this moment in December of 1865, Johnson will veto the Freedmen's Bureau. Johnson will also deny any efforts to use land reform in the interest of the freedmen, and you will see a divide develop between presidential Reconstruction and congressional Reconstruction driven by Republicans in Congress. So when Republicans in Congress received Andrew Johnson's declaration that that Reconstruction had been completed, Congress, the Republican Congress, was appalled. They were very angry by the fact that Johnson had really ignored a major part of what Reconstruction should have been about, which was about creating a truer democracy in the South in which freedmen, African Americans, had gained some kind of political voice. The radical Republicans in particular, led by guys like Thaddeus Stevens in the House of Representatives, Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, the senator, and of course Charles Sumner is a senator that was infamously caned by Preston Brooks at the outset of the Civil War and the lead up to the Civil War. The radical Republicans want a more stringent Reconstruction. They want to, unlike Andrew Johnson, who also in a way wants to change the South, but Andrew Johnson wants to change the South so that it is a kind of a new version of a white-ruled area of the country. Radical Republicans want a true democracy in the South. They want to change the South in a way to create a development of a democracy in which freedmen play a fair and equal part. And to enforce this and to resist the Reconstruction that has been put forth by the president, Congress will dictate a military Reconstruction in which military leaders are sent to the South, and the South is broken up into military districts, and states are brought back into the Union on a slower process, and a process in which the Republican Congress is satisfied in terms of the democratization in the particular state. However, regardless of these efforts, ultimately you will see the states as they come back into the Union, you will see a return to really status quo leadership in the South, and ultimately, of course, a complete disenfranchisement of African Americans, albeit at this time you will see African Americans do gain some voice and do have some political representation, but it's short-lived, and ultimately Reconstruction fails, and you see the status quo really come to power in the South again, and you'll see the political voice of African Americans in the South really really shunned of being returned to the Union. This is a look at the military Reconstruction districts. It's also a look at when each of these states was brought back into the Union. And this was really, again, this was an effort by radical Republican-led Congress to really carry through what they believed was the promise of emancipation, the promise of a new kind of freedom that resulted from the Civil War. The situation in the South, of course, is desperate. There's homelessness. On all sides. You've had death of a fifth of the young adult male population. This is like World War I, like Western Front levels for the United States. Farms and cities are utterly destroyed. Farmland has been destroyed or dispossessed. Many freedmen took up residence on huge tracts of land in South Carolina, and these were lands that had been dispossessed, farms that had been destroyed by Sherman's troops, and these lands became known as Sherman's land. And the idea was that Sherman was taking a step that had been suggested during the war that there would be a land reform measure. And so Sherman took that step on his own effectively and created what Freedmen called Sherman's Land, which was this land, this dispossessed farmland that was then basically given to the freedmen to divvy up and to farm. And so this was an early effort at land reform, actually. Of course, land reform utterly fails. When Republicans led the Reconstruction process, of course, Confederate officers and politicians were barred from full U.S. citizenship. They were barred from participation in the government. And there was a very significant dispute over labor and land in the South. Republicans in the North, they promote the idea of free labor, of course, which we remember studying a little bit about this. Southerners effectively want to return to slavery. And, of course, freedmen want land. For freedmen, land was integral to freedom. To freedom, and in your reading of Foner, of course, you get the view that of course, freedmen were very politically active. They formed churches. They helped to create schools. They formed political organizations. But the number one element of freedmen for land in many cases was land, and the acquisition of it. Ultimately, when you look at these three factors, what you see fall in place really is something called sharecropping, which was in a lot of cases, sharecropping was almost as bad as slavery. And sharecropping was a system in which a farm would be severed into tenant farms, and the tenants would pay a rent. And ultimately, by the time you paid your rent and by the time you purchased what you needed for each growing season, it was almost impossible to make a profit. And so the South, in many cases, becomes dominated ultimately by a sharecropping system, which, while somewhat less, I suppose, physically repressive than slavery, sharecropping took on many of the forms of bondage. So the result of these disputes, with Andrew Johnson as president, there would be no land reform. Many in Republican Congress had sought land reform, of course, but Andrew Johnson vetoed this. And as I said, sharecropping, a kind of pseudo-enslavement, really takes over in many of the areas of the South. The Freedmen's Bureau, if you remember at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned that the Freedmen's Bureau was another example of really the expansion of federal power. The Freedmen's Bureau really represented the first, most thorough time in which the federal government sought to create a program that would go into a region and provide widespread support for the public good, if you will. The Freedmen's Bureau, which was incredibly contentious in the South. This was, of course, from the Southern perspective, this was the North dictating how to organize their society. And so it was incredibly controversial. The Freedmen's Bureau, though, it was intended, and it becomes the heart of controversy. It's really the Freedmen's Bureau moment in 1865 when Johnson vetoes this that you see Congress really break away from Johnson and begin to direct Reconstruction on their own. The goal of the Freedmen's Bureau, it was kind of like a social welfare organization, if you will. It was kind of a precursor of similar style government programs in the future. It was intended to help huge displaced populations. I mean, the South is destroyed on a level that we really can't even comprehend. And so the idea was to use the Freedmen's Bureau to help the displaced populations, white and black. Of course, generally the thrust was towards the black population, but nonetheless, it was there designed to provide assistance to displaced populations in general. They built schools, medical care, basic medical care. They tried to do land redistribution, as I just mentioned. It was a major issue, and land redistribution efforts really fail, especially amid the veto of Johnson. But they built schools. There were many teachers who came south to help in the in the education of freedmen, which of course the freedmen had a really insatiable appetite for education, and education had been purposely withheld to African American slaves really throughout the 1800s. This was obviously to repel resistance. They tried to use a lack of it, or they tried to limit availability of education as a way of quelling potential resistance. And so African American slaves possessed very little education, and so the Freedmen's Bureau was designed to help with this. And of course, churches also help with this. And churches were probably the first truly unique African American social and political unit. It was an unprecedented level of federal role in social affairs in the history of the country. Of course, Southerners will oppose the Bureau, and many Southerners oppose it despite the fact that much of the opposition was driven solely by racism. Many Southerners are resisting because they're trying to kind of protect their way of existence, but they opposed it in many cases on the Bureau of corruption. And of course, I think you might say that there were elements in the Freedmen's Bureau that were corrupt. But the reality of it is that during this time in American politics, and you'll see, well, you won't see because we are ending now, but if we go on to discuss the Gilded Age, you'll see that corruption was absolutely part and parcel to American politics at this time. So it was hardly unique to the Freedmen's Bureau. Johnson's refusal to renew the Bureau in 1865 really was the thing that resulted in an intense political battle with Congress. And of course, Congress wins this battle. Johnson becomes a lame duck president. Ultimately, Johnson really had no power. He was having many of his vetoes overridden by Congress. He was stubborn and unwilling to compromise his viewpoint on many aspects. And so Johnson's presidency fizzles and fades amid intense opposition from the Congress to effectively his plan to not do anything in terms of creating a new promise of freedom in the United States. So this is the last slide, and of course, this picture, this image, this is a placard. This is a Democratic campaign placard, basically, from 1866, from Pennsylvania, actually. And of course, this is deeply racist, and it depicts the racist stereotype that predominated, that was predominant in much of the country at this time. The Freedmen's Bureau was intensely opposed by Democrats against the Republican Congress. Democrats like Andrew Johnson advised Southern states to resist the activities of the Freedmen's Bureau. This is before he vetoes it. Later, when the 14th Amendment's passed, Andrew Johnson will encourage those Southern states to refuse to support the 14th Amendment. So, as you can see, this is a deeply racist image. This placard is deeply racist in nature, and this kind of shows how some Americans depicted the freedmen versus the white. And of course, it's complete nonsense. African American slaves had really built the country, and this you see depicting the freedmen as lazy, as getting some kind of a beneficial handout. And of course, this kind of racial stereotype in the South was predominant in things like the black codes, which we'll see in next week's discussion. Black codes were laws that were designed to control the African American population. So African Americans at the end of the war, they're moving around. They're trying to find family member that have been displaced. They're moving and going to cities. Sometimes they're seeking labor in cities. They're moving about. This is a huge change for them, and they're trying to understand their world. They're trying to discover this new kind of freedom that is the promise of this new kind of freedom. And so African American freedmen are moving about on the roads and things like this, but in an attempt to control the population, the status quo passes things like the black codes, in which you could be arrested for laziness, you could be arrested for walking around the road, you could be, if you didn't have a contract signed to work for somebody, you could be taken and forced to work for somebody else. In many cases, freedmen were captured and taken and forced to work for their former masters on their former plantations, despite emancipation. There was also an incredible amount of violence, much of it directed by whites against the freedmen, as whites sought to protect what was left of their world and their society before this, and as African Americans tried to struggle to find the promise of freedom, which for them was very important, was the acquisition of land, of education, of political activism, of economic independence. And so there's a huge clash between these in the South, and of course, as you can see here, deeply racist, as many Americans sought to resist in opposition to the ethnic nationalism that had defined the United States for almost a century to that time. And they continued to assert that America was white and that citizens of the country were white and not black. Anyway, I hope this helps, guys, and let's have a great week.